Hello everybody and welcome to this week's edition of A Slice of History with the Butterfly Princess. This week I'm reading you another article from the February 2025 edition of the BBC History magazine. Now this article has been written by a gentleman called Luke Pepera, who is a Ghanaian-born writer, broadcaster and historian. So this article is about African history. So here goes. In 1414, in the Chinese city of Nuremberg, a griffle caused a stir. In a crowd of shocked noble spectators, an official leading the creature via a rope tied around its face presented it to China's local emperor. His officials said it was a unicorn which his sage governess had made appear. The griffle was a gift from the Sultan of Bengal, but it had originally come from Africa, specifically the city-state of Mandela in today's Kenya. In 1415, ambassadors from Mandela and Mandela sailed to China in a special ceremony. The Mandela ambassadors gifted the local empire another graffle. Delighted at having received his second crib, the young empire gave an order. His senior admiral, whom he charged with overseeing the construction of a 200-strong fleet of treasure ships, went sailed to obtain more and other goods. With the whole of his ship full of treasures, including gold, silver, silk, and cribbers, he set sail from in 1417. He exchanged what he had for goods, including live animals such as leopards and zebras, frankincense and ivory. Sometime between then and 1423, Merlin's king himself sailed to China to meet the emperor in Nanjing. He made it as far as a province in southeastern China, where he died, seemingly succumbing to illness. He was buried in Fungi, and the Uighur Empire decreed that his grave be given a small sacrifice each year. This is an intriguing story, but for Africa it's not extraordinary. For at least 2,000 years, African civilizations have been plunged into international trade networks. 3rd century AD Nubia, now northern Sudan, and southern Egypt exported goods including gold, ivory, and ostrich feathers to Rome and Yemen along Africa's eastern coast from northern Solomon to southern Tanzania. East African merchants exchanged similar goods for date syrup from Persian traders, salt from Yemen, and beads from India. Chinese pottery and Indian beads have been found as far inland as Great Zambia, a stone city located in southwest Zambia that thrived between about 1000 and 1500 AD. Great Zambia's residents obtained these treasures from East African merchants in exchange for gold, which was plentiful around Great Zambia. Chinese silk also made it as far west as Mali, whose empress had it woven into robes. One-dimensional view. Given historical African society's economic, political and cultural importance, why is so little of their history generally known? Quite simply, this is because of a tendency to focus on narratives of slavery, colonisation, victimisation and dominance in the UK, when we tell stories about African people or their history, either in the classroom or in documentaries, books, films, and TV series. We cover largely the events of the transatlantic slave trade and colonisation. We talk and tell stories about European discovery of the Americas, the Atlantic Triangle ambition, anti-African racism, European presence in Africa, colonial wars, and the British Empire. In all of these narratives, the African is represented as a victim of superior European technology, economic might, and military powers. This then becomes our view of the African throughout history, and arguably even our view of Africans today. We assume that this relationship between Europe and Africa has always been the natural order of things, and we do little to scrutinise, interrogate, or contradict this view. The truth is, our conversations about African history and culture lack nuance. As far as the eras of the transatlantic slave trade and colonisation are concerned, we don't question enough how and why they happened. To our minds, it is a simple story of dominance, European over African. We think that when the Europeans arrived in Africa, they almost immediately subdued in societies, imposed their rules and regulations, and captured the poor, unwittingly Africans whom they stuffed in slave ships and shipped off to the Americas. We think that in this scenario, Africans had only two options: capitulate and trade slaves willingly or be destroyed. We don't consider for a moment African agency. In these turning points in world history, if we dig a little bit deeper into the history of these events to look at things from the African perspective, we would see that in many places the scenario I've sketched out here wasn't what necessarily happened. A war on slavery. Take 18th century, what is now Benin, and arguably its best king, as an example. Born in circa 1673, the king was crowned in 1708. From the records we have of him, including those of an English Royal African country, those of an English Royal African Company agent called Bluefinch Lamb, who was forced to live with for 3 years. We know that Andrew was handsome, majestic, intelligent, an incomparable strategist and military commander. In 1724 and 1727, Angela invaded the nearby kingdom of Angela and Woodley, respectively. At the time, both of these kingdoms were the region's premier slave traders. Since the late 17th century, the Europeans in this region, including the Dutch, Portuguese, English, and French, had their slaving headquarters in one or both of these kingdoms. Annually, both exported close to 20,000 enslaved Africans, mostly prisoners of war, those who committed crimes are broken serious taboos. Some historians, such as Genzel, who was not only a late 18th century historian, but also a slave trader who had spent significant time in both of these regions of Africa, argued invading and because he wanted to take over their slave trading infrastructures. However, the king immediately went about demolishing these structures, destroying ports, forts, and castles almost with glee. He also showed little interest in preserving good relationships with the Europeans in Andalusia. In fact, he took around about 40% of them as his prisoner. When he claimed his control over the two regions of Africa, this king also did nothing to repair the slave trading infrastructures he destroyed. Instead, he ordered his soldiers to stop slave traders from bringing enslaved people to the coast. He also jailed someone who tried to sell enslaved people. When Europeans made to leave for kingdoms whose rulers were more hospitable to the idea of selling enslaved people, the king blocked them. The Europeans complained that trade dropped off a cliff and that they couldn't see it returning to its previous levels as long as remaining in power. What's more, any difficulty and it faced in holding on to power came not from Europeans, but largely from other great African kingdoms who, for one reason or another, disagreed with his politics. Oh yes, it's the state of Yoruba people in what's now Nigeria. Nigeria was one such rival. His rulers felt that in conquering neighbouring kingdoms, Adja had convened age-old customs that had for centuries been governed by relationships between the coastal West African kingdoms. But stories like Adja's, where the African isn't presented solely as an agency, less victim at the mercy of the Europeans with whom they dealt, are solely missing from our conceptions on telling of African history. Complex cultures. Another way in which I understand. Another way in which our understanding of African history lacks nuance is in a poor appreciation for the true breadth and depth of African history and culture. The earliest ancestor in this evolutionary line that produced our species, Homo species, is said to be Salon man of Chad, who lived in around that part of Africa 7 million years ago. Until the emergence of Homo entry some 5 million years later, early humans lived only in Africa. What's crucial to remember is that it wasn't the only early human being who inhabited the continent. There were lots of different groups of these hominids that probably migrated back and forth across it, lived in different areas, developed differently, and then mixed with others, resulting in the emergence of plenty of new groups. It is largely this deep history, diversity, and mixing that means Africans today are some of the most ethnically, culturally, and racially diverse people on Earth. Africans speak around a third of the world's 7,000 languages. African boasts the largest language group in the world. Niger Congo, which contains around 1,500 languages spoken by more than 300 million people. Africa also boasts one of the oldest language groups in the world, Chaosian, whose 35 languages emerged from one that is said to have been spoken as far back as 2,000 years ago. A misunderstanding of the depth and complexity of African culture is often what led to the 19th century European anthropologists to dismiss certain aspects of these cultures are unnecessary. One such aspect that comes to mind is witchcraft. Early European anthropologists saw it largely as a universal belief system They mostly didn't account for the differences in African people. Witchcraft's beliefs nor could they conceive of the practical purposes these beliefs served. For example, in the case of Azad, people of what is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo and South Sudan, witchcraft was about diffusing tensions and restoring social harmony. The Aztec believed that you bewitched someone by feeling negatively towards them. In other words, if a Zang, the signaler of Aztec, was angry, hateful, or resentful towards another person, they bewitched that person, causing them to suffer some kind of misfortune, falling ill, say. Therefore, when a Zanga suffered a misfortune, they thought of someone with whom they had a problem. They then confronted the person in sympathy for explaining what they'd been going through and asked for reconciliation. Customarily, the letter compiled and social harmony was restored. Another aspect that comes to mind is African female leadership. To many European observers, this represented the inverse of their societies, one in which men dominated industry and the public sphere, whereas women were often relegated to second-class citizens. In short, these African societies represented them Amazonians, but this wasn't really the case. In many female-led African societies, there was actually a balance of power between men and women. From about 25 to 21 BC, the Libyans and the Romans, the latter under their first emperor Augustus Caesar, were at war. Rome had conquered Egypt and northern Libya. When the Nubians rebelled, their king and queen, their king to the queen, let them when their support of their royal army. In Libya, the king didn't have absolute authority. In various ways, he shared this authority with his mother, the queen's mother, and his wife. The Nubians believed that autonomy and balance was the foundation of success in any sphere. This included in rulership, which required both male and female energies to function successfully. It was not unusual that when Testicle died in one of the war's early conflicts, she was succeeded by their young son, was not yet elected king. She then sacked Roman Egyptian cities, took prisoners, and looted statues of Augustus, securing a victory for the Nubians and a favourable peace treaty from Augustus himself. She is best known as the Nubian royal women who ruled the last Nubian kingdom nearly absolutely. Gaps in the story. These stories represent just a fraction of the breadth, depth, and nuance of African people's history and cultures. If we not only want to understand truly the African past, but also fill in a significant gap in the story of our species, we need to consider that African perspective, even when it comes to well-trodden areas of history like the transatlantic slave trade and colonisation. We need to understand and present Africans and their history more accurately. Africans having historically been only the enslaved or the conquered. We've been emperors, sculptors, merchants, architects, and scholars. We've navigated our continent and the globe. We've created world-class architecture and art. We've innovated with leading academic, government, and industry installate. This is some of the African history we need to see in books, documentaries, films, and TV series. If we fail to explore the history, we give birth not just to Africans, but to people of other societies who otherwise come away with an understanding of the peoples that have inhabited our world the longest. that then concludes this week's edition of A Slice of History with the Butterfly Princess show, with the Butterfly Princess. And this article was written by Luke Pepera, who is a Ghanaian-born writer, broadcaster and historian. So thank you for tuning in to this week's edition. I hope you can join me for next week's edition. Until then, have a lovely rest of your week. Take care, and I'll see you again very soon. Bye.